Red Lobster brought endless shrimp back in April 2026. That sounds strange because the promotion is often blamed for the company's bankruptcy. The filing tells a less tidy story. Red Lobster said the permanent $20 version cost about $11 million. In the same filing, the company reported approximately $190.5 million in lease obligations for 2023. More than $64 million was tied to underperforming restaurants. Those numbers measure different things. They should not be added together or treated as a direct comparison. The point is simpler. Management could stop a promotion. It could not quickly walk away from hundreds of leases. When Red Lobster brought the shrimp back, the filing already made clear that the promotion was not the sole cause. It returned as a limited offer after bankruptcy had dealt with a much larger set of problems. Red Lobster filed for Chapter 11 on May 19, 2024. 6 days earlier, it had closed and vacated 93 restaurants. The company's declaration reported a $76 million net loss for fiscal 2023, guest counts about 30% below 2019, and less than $30 million in cash. Roughly 6 months earlier, it had about $100 million. Red Lobster also reported approximately $294 million of funded debt. This was still a large and familiar business. At the time of the filing, Red Lobster said it served more than 64 million guests a year, employed roughly 36,000 people, and operated 551 restaurants in the United States, plus locations in Canada and other countries. The brand still had customers and roughly $2 billion in annual revenue. The immediate problem was that its cash had fallen while its fixed bills kept coming. To understand why, we have to go back to the chain's condition before the 2014 sale. Red Lobster started as one Florida restaurant in 1968. General Mills bought it in 1970 and expanded it nationally. In 1995, General Mills spun its restaurant division into Darden Restaurants, which also owned Olive Garden. By 2014, Red Lobster had already been struggling for years. Darden told investors that average weekly guest counts per Red Lobster restaurant had fallen 21% over the previous decade. It pointed to pressure on middle-class customers, more seafood competition, higher costs, and promotions that brought people in but made normal prices harder to restore. Just before the sale, Darden reported 706 Red Lobster restaurants in the United States and Canada. 474 were on sites the company owned. The other 232 were leased. That split matters because the later real estate deal did not create the decline in customer traffic. The decline was already there. The chain, therefore, had less room to absorb any new fixed cost. What the deal did was add more long-term rent to a business that was already losing customers. In May 2014, Darden agreed to sell Red Lobster to the private equity firm Golden Gate Capital for approximately $2.1 billion in cash. 3 parties had different roles in the transaction. Darden sold the chain. Golden Gate bought the restaurant business. American Realty Capital Properties, known as ARCP, bought much of the real estate and became the landlord. At closing, ARCP said it acquired approximately 500 Red Lobster restaurant properties in a sale-leaseback valued at roughly $1.5 billion. The property sale closed alongside Golden Gate's acquisition and supported its financing. The $2.1 billion acquisition and the $1.5 billion property transaction were connected, but they were not two prices for the same asset. Subtracting one from the other does not produce Red Lobster's purchase price. The acquisition also involved debt financing, taxes, transaction costs, operating assets, and assumed obligations. The clean version is this. Darden received the acquisition consideration. Golden Gate controlled the restaurant company. ARCP owned a large property portfolio. Red Lobster continued operating in many of those buildings as a tenant. After the sale, the restaurant company no longer owned those properties. A sale-leaseback is not automatically a bad deal. Suppose a restaurant company owns a building worth $3 million. The building is an asset, although the company still pays for maintenance, taxes, and insurance. In a sale-leaseback, the company sells the building for cash, signs a lease, and keeps operating in the same place. The seller gets money it can use immediately. The buyer gets rent. The restaurant gives up the property and takes on a recurring payment. That trade can work if the cash is invested well and the business earns more than the added occupancy cost. It becomes a problem when sales fall and the rent remains fixed. ARCP announced a 7.9% cash capitalization rate for the roughly $1.5 billion portfolio. Applied to the announced price, that implies about $118.5 million in first-year cash yield. That is our arithmetic estimate, not a rent figure disclosed by Red Lobster. ARCP also said 93.5% of the portfolio would begin with 25-year lease terms. The remaining leasehold assets had an 18.7-year weighted average initial term. The master leases included annual rent increases of 2%. Those terms gave the property owner long, growing payments. They gave the restaurant company less room to adjust when business slowed. One accounting point needs to be clear. The $190.5 million reported for 2023 covered lease obligations across all 687 leased locations in Red Lobster's bankruptcy declaration. That total included 247 locations in master leases and 440 under individual property leases. It was not the rent bill for only the properties sold in 2014. Red Lobster's locations, leases, and landlords changed over the following decade. The 2014 transaction still matters because it shows how property that once supported the restaurant operation became a separate asset owned by a landlord. The restaurant business then carried long-term rent on many of those sites. By 2023, Red Lobster said a material portion of its leases were above market. More than $64 million in lease obligations related to underperforming restaurants. That was at least 1/3 of the total lease obligation. The obligation remained even when individual restaurants performed poorly. A restaurant can cut hours, change its menu, or order less food. Renegotiating or leaving a long lease is much harder. Rent was not Red Lobster's only problem. Annual guest counts were approximately 30% below 2019 and had only partly recovered from the pandemic. Adjusted EBITDA for the 12 months before the filing had fallen by more than 60%. Food and labor costs rose. The bankruptcy declaration said restaurant menu prices had increased faster than grocery prices, which gave customers another reason to eat at home. Higher minimum wages put more pressure on restaurant margins. Debt left less room for mistakes. During fiscal 2023, Red Lobster made approximately $32 million in interest payments. A change to vendor-managed inventory reduced the borrowing base of its asset-backed facility and forced a $27 million debt paydown. From June through September 2023, the company also reported approximately $31 million in operating cash losses. Those figures cover different periods and accounting categories, so they do not form a single, clean calculation. Together, they show why liquidity disappeared so quickly. In about 6 months, Red Lobster's cash fell from around $100 million to less than $30 million. Weak traffic, rent, interest, operating losses, and working capital pressure all hit at once.